Welcome to Daring To, a podcast that finds out how CEOs and entrepreneurs navigate today's business world. The conventions they're breaking, the challenges they faced, and the decisions that they've made. And lastly, just what makes them different. Well, if you're sitting at home this afternoon and you are wondering what to do, I'm glad you've tuned into today's podcast, because joining me today, we may be touching on the coronavirus, but maybe not in a way that you've heard before. So do listen in. Joining me is Shazia Ginai. She's the CEO of Neuro-Insight. Shazia, you have a background that's in marketing, but we're going to talk about marketing from a very different perspective. Highly acclaimed. I'm also both honoured to be interviewing you because you are also passionate about a particular charity in the UK, which I also have experienced myself. So around endometriosis. So I am, it heartens me to see that there are women out there that speak about it, because it is a condition that affects many, many women around the world. And as somebody that had suffered from it in the past, it was both heartwarming and kind of put me in my place that maybe I should have been doing more in those days to sort of spread the news. But let's move on, because let's talk about a really important topic, which is what neuroscience is about. I mean, your career has been in marketing. You've worked for some of the big players in the industry, P&G and others, obviously. But you became CEO about a year ago, so we're going to talk about that journey a little bit. But I want to start off with what you guys actually do, which I am really curious about. And you use a phrase about bringing the subconscious to the conscious and neuromarketing. Now, I don't know, I've been around the block a bit, right? And I've heard of neuroscience, but neuromarketing, is that just a buzzword?
I get asked that quite a lot. Thanks so much for having me. Firstly, to everyone listening, I hope you're all safe and well in this surreal moment in human history. And hopefully we can sort of change the subject a bit by talking about neuroscience and neuromarketing. But yeah, it's a fascinating space. It's a space that's kind of come to life maybe over the last decade or so. I got into this through a series of accidents and curiosity and passion, but neuromarketing's just that level up of understanding the human truth. We talk about making the subconscious conscious, because what we're actually doing is we're tapping into the seat of all of our decision making, which is the brain. There are many, many research techniques that exist out there in the marketing space. Lots of qualitative, quantitative research techniques. And then you move into the space of biometrics, where you have things like eye tracking and facial coding, and they allow you to understand physiological responses to things that are happening to people. But actually the seat of all of it is in the brain. And that's what neuromarketing is about. It's about understanding your subconscious mind and getting real insight. So, the business that I run, is called Neuro-Insight, and we have a proprietary technology called steady state topography, or SST for short, because as you said, I'm an ex-P&G'er, which means I love an acronym. And SST is an amazing tech that was created by a neuroscience professor. So it's rooted very much in the science, but we've brought it to the commercial world in order to allow us to generate kind of insights for the marketing space.
And tell us a little bit about that, because, in the world where today we are crowded with competitors, companies are struggling to figure out how to differentiate themselves. Technology is changing how business is done in so many different levels. As an individual, we have access to so much information, and we are so, I think, attuned now to both information and personalization, right? We want things the way we want them, how we want them. You guys have an interesting take on how you're using SST to sort of look at that and helping companies to really figure out how to connect to consumers like yourself, like me and you, when we look at, do we buy something? Don't we buy something? We've seen, I can recall a couple of years ago when the Volkswagen issue hit, their brand reputation, which was, people loved them and looked at their marketing because they were a company you could trust, and then, crash and burn, they have an emissions issue and nobody wants to buy their product anymore, right? They only want to drive a Volkswagen car. How does SST work? I mean, what does it actually do?
So SST measures electrical activity in the brain. So our brains are incredibly busy. And you gave a really interesting example there because you recalled something that clearly was encoded into your memory. And that's kind of key to what we look at. Now, with measuring electrical activity in the brain, there are other things that people do sometimes use, so things like EEG. The way SST works, which is different, is, people wear a headset, so they've got a cap on their heads with little sensors on them. And those little felt sensors, they are kind of spaced on your brain in various positions. Now, our brains are really specialized. So the way it works is different areas of the brain are responsible for different cognitive functions. And we, by using SST, can measure the activity in all those different regions of the brain. Now, they also do wear a visor. This is what makes SST so unique. So they wear a visor, which you can see straight through, but there's a flickering light in the periphery of the vision that sets a stimulus signal in the brain. And we track the electrical activity of all those different regions versus that signal. So you strip away all the noise, because our brains are very noisy. They have a lot going on. They work at lots of different frequencies, which is why SST is a really robust way, because of that stimulus signal, to allow us to measure what's going on. And as I said, your example, you recalled something which was embedded in memory. Now, with SST, for marketers or, brands that are trying to get their message across and trying to sell some magic and a dream to their consumers, what's really critical is that their brand and that call to action and that message is encoded into their memory, but for the long term. So that's what we're measuring. It's one of the things that we're measuring. We're measuring what goes into your memory center. And we look at that both from the left and right side of the brain. So our left brain is where our speech capability develops. So it's where we process a lot of our very granular, detailed information, lots of detailed words and phrases. And then the right side is responsible for processing that more bigger picture, overall feel of something, that holistic processing. And what we know from the academic work that's been done is that memory, long-term memory, it correlates to future decision-making, action, and behavior change. So it's really important for brands to understand what goes in. Now, there are ways you can do kind of qualitative research or quantitative, where you're asking people questions, but we're reliant then on a human being's ability to articulate what they think and feel. And we're kind of limited from that point of view, About 90% of our decisions are made in our subconscious.
Okay, I saw that. Like 95% of our decisions are made by the subconscious. I'm like, I'm going to take that fact. I'm going to take that home to my husband and say, when I'm making a decision, when you want to make a decision, you say it's based on fact. I now have some proof that actually it's not. So don't try and pull that one over me. But that just blew me away. That blew me away.
It's so fascinating, because there's so much stuff going on in there that we don't even know. And equally, we aren't able to know or able to articulate. And so being able to measure the subconscious gives a layer of insight you just can't get in other ways. Now, it's great knowing what goes into your memory. That's super important. The so what. Every good researcher is looking for the so what, the why behind everything. So we also look at areas of the brain that are responsible for emotion. So certain emotional responses that we have. And that's also a big part of what we do. And by measuring all of those areas, we're able to build a really true picture of how somebody feels and thinks about something. We can quantify it. Quantifying emotion seems like a slightly out there concept, but this is what this technology allows us to do.
Now, you guys did I read that you guys were involved in the Super Bowl in 2019, and living in the US right now, obviously, like the Super Bowl resonates to a lot of my readers, but you guys were responsible in helping some of the companies, I think it was either 7 or 9 of the companies out of the 55, put together their adverts as a company, sort of like trying to appeal and connect to those adverts that come on, which is what we really watch the Super Bowl for. At least that's what I watch the Super Bowl for. And don't tell everybody else, but that's what I watch it for those adverts. Because they are, and like now you're making me think of like what's encoded in my brain. And I always remember the E-Trade adverts from a few years back, where they would have the little kid that would be like, making deals and stuff like that. That was obviously, as you call it now, encoded in my brain. But how do you get companies to sort of buy into this idea of neuroscience? Because like we've been out doing marketing for years, right? And most people are like, let's go get a focus group together. Let's go ask people what they think. Let's like do little surveys at the end of it. Let's, You know, this is kind of like people go, this is a bit like fuzzy. This is a bit like, this is a bit too much for us. So how are you convincing companies that this is this is real? This brings about results?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I myself was client side for a long time. I sort of spent 12 years client side, part of that at P&G, and then I was working at a hairstyling brand after that.
And it's a very well-known hairstyling brand.
Yeah,
like
good old GHD.
Yeah, we love them. Yeah.
Yeah, they're great. Still have some of those. Very brand loyal. But the thing that I found, being both client and agency side, is marketers have been asking the same questions for many, many years, right? And there's a reason that they are still asking those questions. It's because those methodologies that exist, whilst they definitely have their place, they are not giving enough of an answer. And the reason is, going back to that stat, so much of our decision making happens in the subconscious. If you can't tap into it, you can't get the answers that you need. And I think that now we're in an interesting space because people are becoming a lot more open to innovation, but they are also still quite risk averse. Yeah. And we're at a tipping point, where a lot of businesses are looking to do something a little bit wacky, do something a bit more kind of forward thinking, but at the same time, they like to wrap themselves in the safety blanket of, can I have that consumer verbatim that I can go to my key stakeholders with, or can I have that one statistic that's a percentage that's really easily digestible? They're seeing that there's value in thinking outside. So a lot of the conversations that I have, I'll often just, talk to my clients about, why is it that the questions have not been answered? And the reason is because there's no way of answering them unless you tap into the subconscious.
It's a fascinating sort of application that, as you're talking and I think about the applications that could have beyond sort of like the consumer area, I was smiling as you were saying, why is it that marketeers have been asking the same questions for the last X number of years and they're getting the same results? It's, I say the same thing around when I talk to CEOs and around talent and talent development. It's like, why is it? It's like number 3 or it's in the top 3 of CEO concerns every year. And yet, as functions like HR and as leadership, we have not solved that issue because we're using the same stuff that we've always used, and we know it doesn't work, but we still keep doing it, right? So
that one's a really fascinating space. I mean, there's hundreds of psychometric tests, right, that can help us to segment people. There are lots of training programs that exist when it comes to people. I mean, the people side of my job is actually my favorite part of my job. I've always really enjoyed that. And also the work that I do with Endometriosis UK, it's about understanding and enabling humans to grow and thrive. And so I could talk about that for days. Just sort of.
Do you think that it could apply then? Do you see what you're doing in the marketing space as a company, as a CEO? And do you see that being applicable across other areas? I mean, obviously, if we're tapping into the subconscious, which is basically really the conscious, it is actually really the conscious, right? If it's 95% of our decisions are coming from that to some extent.
Everything that, so absolutely, I definitely think it fits in with other areas. I mean, where we're applying it at the moment is in a very commercial space. So we look at brand advertising, we look at shopper journey, we look at context effects of different types of media. But there is a lot more room for this space to grow, particularly SST, to have a role to play in this arena. I mean, we have sort of specific things around kind of sample sizes that we use. So we tend to do a lot less B2B work. We tend to work with more B2C brands. But I mean, that's something as a business that, we are looking into, because I mean, I, for one, think it would be incredible if we could help to improve, working relationships and, anything in the space of training and talent by using this kind of insight. I mean, it would just be so powerful.
I've got goosebumps as you're talking about it, making me think about where that could go. I really have. So let's look on the flip side, right? So here I am, a listener, listening to this, going like, for those of us that are kind of like intrigued by all of this and think it's fascinating, we're going like, wow, we want to hear more. But then, the other side, let's play the other side a little bit. There are people there sitting there like, how dare you think about trying to get into my brain? Like, am I not or is my space not my privacy, my space, my data not already shared enough around world that we live in today. How do you counteract that argument, right?
Yeah,
because it's a tough one.
It is a tough one. But, ultimately, I think the key to everything is consent.
Yeah.
And, in every way. And I think that where there's been a lot of discussion around people's data and what their data is being used for, I think, the most critical thing any business can do in this space is be transparent. I mean, we all know what happened with the Cambridge Analytica scandal.
Yeah.
And anybody who works in the research space, we know that data is such a powerful commodity, and humans can either use it for good or use it for evil. So as a business, Neuro-Insight, we have an ethical policy. So there are some categories that we refuse to work with. Mm-hmm. So our ethical policy states we don't work with tobacco, gambling, or kind of payday loans, anything that in its intended usage could cause harm. But when it comes to otherwise, when people are saying, oh, but you're getting inside my head, you're using my information to tailor something, that's what any kind of research does. If you ask people to fill in a survey, if you ask them to come to a focus group, you're using their words to help develop something. And the thing is, most brands, the likes of P&G or Unilever, they're creating products that change our lives for the better. Mm-hmm. And they're the brands that we work with, the ones that are changing lives to improve them. And so helping them to be able to create the right kind of communication for those products that will help change people's lives for the better. Arguably, that's what marketing has been forever. And this is just another level of getting to the truth behind how you do that.
So how quickly do you think it'll take off? I mean, we've seen the neuroscience sort of field expand. Neuromarketing has expanded, but it hasn't really taken off that much yet, right? There are, I think some of your research or the research that's out there says that the sort of projections, I guess, for up in 2026 are around like a compound growth of 12% or something like that. So, I mean, it looks like it could grow massively. How convinced are you that that's true, that people will shift away from that known safe environment and actually try to build, I guess, strategies, but also like connect to people? Because this is about connection, right? What I took away from reading about the company and what you guys do is like, this is all about connections.
Yeah, I mean, I really, if you'd have asked me this 2 months ago, I would have said it's expanding and it will continue to expand. There will be a soft change. So the data that exists, people will need soft changes from that into this new world of using neuro data. The outputs are different, so they need to be able to understand how it looks. So it will happen. It will be slower. I actually think, given the way that the world is going right now, when we come out of the back of the COVID-19 situation, the world will have changed. Marketers will be asking questions in a slightly different way. And I think that will actually enhance and sort of speed up the progress that neuro is making, because asking people how they think or feel, I'm not sure that we're going to get the right answers. I remember when I was at P&G, and I also recorded a podcast about 2 months ago about sound and music, because we've done a lot of work on looking at how humans are very visually dominant, but how sound and music can impact our brains. And one of the things that I've always said is that people find it very difficult. In qualitative research, I've heard them say the two things that they find difficult to explain their feelings around are smell and music. There are some things that we just can't explain.
How interesting.
And coming out of a crisis or things that are incredibly emotive, being able to articulate those feelings and being able to articulate why behaviors have changed. And also, we are going to be coming out of this as more values-driven brand buyers, right?
Hurrah.
And shoppers.
Yes.
And I definitely think that being able to get the answers out of people with the limitations that we have on, our ability to explain means that these techniques will become even more critical.
Well, I have to concur with you on that one. I also have a believe that that we are going to see differences, when the idea of sort of like back to normal is going to look very different, and the winners and the losers from a business perspective are coming out of COVID-19 are going to be those that have really like fallen back on those values, those principles, those purpose, and how they've actually handled this sort of situation. Because I think you're going to start to sort of I think it's going to be really interesting what gets revealed, right, about how companies really operate, because we are now operating in ways we've never really operated on the scale that we're operating right now. But,
for sure.
But, you made the point about, if I'd asked you 2 months ago, you would have said, one answer, and now you're saying another. What do you think that people what will change in marketing? What will marketeers or organizations be asking? Because nobody wants to know. I think people are tired of being asked, like, how are you feeling about this, right? Because, as you say, it's kind of a difficult question to respond to.
I mean, the tricky part is we can only hypothesize right now. I feel like we're in the middle of something we don't fully understand. And even sort of in terms of countries, everyone's kind of going through different stages of the same crisis in terms of how far or how long they've been locked down, what that isolation looks like, and also the impact on the economy. But I do think that marketers are they're not just going to be asking the same old stuff. Things like usage and attitude studies, habits and practices, all those basic fundamentals that make up segmentation models or shopper journey models, understanding kind of the share in the market, the size of the market, the way that people are actually interacting with brands and products. Those changes are going to cause people to ask like very different questions. And I think the questions are so we've always had a lot of questions around how do we tell a story? I think that's one of the main things that marketers talk about, particularly in advertising, like how do we tell the right story? I think that there will be a bigger question around what are the intrinsic values that humans now hold dear, and how do those values now manifest themselves in terms of their interaction and their relationship with the other humans in their world. One of the things that we know in terms of brain response is that our brains are wired to look for stories. That we make meaning of life through stories. We make sense of the world through stories. We actually don't like brands. There's a bit at the front of our brain called the orbitofrontal cortex, which actually acts as a human ad blocker. It doesn't exist when you're a kid. It's sort of why you believe in the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus. And
don't tell me that they don't exist now. Like, I'm like, that's been keeping me going during this lockdown.
But that bit of the brain that allows us to believe in fairy tales and all those beautiful things, it develops when you're in your late teens to help you assess risk as an adult. And what happens is it also is the bit that doesn't like being sold to. And it's just the bit that just doesn't like brands. So if you have advertising where the brand is shoved in your face right at the start, your brain will tune out. It does not want to be sold to. So your brain is always looking for stories. That's how it works. Now, what we will see is the way we put narrative together ongoing will change. You talked about the Super Bowl earlier. So in the US, obviously, it is like the big event with the very long ad breaks and the extensive advertising and all the sort of hype around it beforehand. Same as for Christmas, right? In the UK, people are actively waiting for the day John Lewis plays their ad.
Exactly.
And the reason is because those ads, they are all stories, that they are really powerful stories. Now, in this future world that we're going into, not so distant future, when we come out the back of this, it's not just going to be about story, it's going to be about emotion, as I said. And one of the other things, so we've done some work with ThinkBox, so the trade body for TV advertising in the UK, where we've looked at the drivers of creative effectiveness. And one of them, which is so relevant right now, is our brains really love human interaction. And you said the word earlier, it's about connection. I mean, we walk around on this earth all our lives doing what? We're looking for love, right?
Yeah.
We look for human connection and love, whether that's romantic love, friendship, families, or whatever else. And, that is going to heavily play out even more than it ever has when we come out the back of this, where we're distanced from people and we can finally be united. But the way it manifests itself will change. And I think that's where a lot of the questions are going to be coming out from.
Fascinating sort of insight as to how, we can see this playing out in the future. I wonder, there's lots of we've seen it in the UK, we've seen it here in the US, we've seen it in lots of other countries in Europe and around the world of, governments sort of appealing people, stay at home, this is lockdown, this is important, these are the things you need to do and not do. In a sense, right, they are making advertising pleas, if you like, or marketing pleas to the world at large. If you apply your kind of neuroscience thinking to that, how do you think that they could be appealing or doing something differently, or are they doing it okay in terms of what they're doing? Just curious as to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the messages and the calls to action are really critical, so they have to come across in the same way you would in any brand ad or anything. I think we've seen some different examples from the NHS here, and also different examples on certain TV channels. So one of the TV channels, Comedy Central, they have a little ad that comes on, which is about staying at home. The ones that I have seen, the ones I would say would have the most impact from the brain's point of view, are the ones where they're showing some form of human interaction and people. So they've done some brilliant stuff where they've showed like little vignettes or clips of people sort of giving messages from their homes. We've seen that the brain responds really well when you have a direct address to the viewer. Yeah. Because then the viewer feels like the brain of the viewer will feel like it's part of the narrative that it's being told rather than being removed from it. And so I think in those cases that works really well, showing people in an environment that is at home for a start, because there's a bit of our brains that we measure, which is, we call it the metric engagement or personal relevance. It's a part of your brain that's responsible for activating if you see something you relate to. And again, when you show people in that setting that feels familiar and relevant, that will activate the brain. That part of the brain is also something that drives information into memory, because we've done some correlation analysis around that. So we know that if you can show something of relevance, it will help drive it into memory. If you make people feel like they're part of the narrative, that will also drive it into memory. So those are the examples where I would say it's more effective than just having some text come up on the screen. Now, understandably, for advertisers right now, it's quite tough shooting an ad of any description.
Yeah, and getting it right?
Yeah, so, and I think there's something really authentic about the ones that show the clips,
Yeah.
It's super authentic, because I think everybody is very aware that we're all in this. It's not just affecting a social class or a country. No. We're all in it. This is bigger than all of us. Nature's taken the planet back, right?
Yeah, so, it has, right? Yeah. And it's interesting, you've made me think about all of the little video clips that I've been getting, on family sort of groups that you have and friendship groups, and the ones that I've really connected to are the ones that they show people in their own homes, kind of, doing something lighthearted or trying to sort of connect to people around what's happening right now, to say hey, look, we know this is from a head teacher sort of doing her own version of I Think I Will Survive, to lots of other ones that I've seen that have been very funny, but also, as you say, they kind of bring that kind of emotional connection to that. So I'm going to pass that message on to my friendship virtual commune group that we have created. We're testing out whether we could actually live in a commune together when we get old. We're realizing that maybe we can't, but that's on a virtual basis. But the idea of having that sort of connection, I think, is important. I'm going to switch tacks a little bit, because I have to give a big shout out, because you are a fellow female CEO. Yeah. There are not enough of us in the world.
We're very rare.
Right? So I like to make a big deal about it when we've got them on the show, because, hopefully it's an inspiration to those that are thinking about it or have never considered taking their management careers forward. So you're a really interesting character, because I like to do my research on my guests, but I can't find too much about your background and stuff like that. Normally I find one little piece of nugget, and I wondered if that was partly a female trait that we have as women, that we don't tend to be all out there and say, look at me, who I am and what I am, and these are all the great things that I do. There's loads of stuff that talk about you giving an opinion, and you've done some great articles and some great stories about neuroscience and also about the passions that you have. But tell us a little bit about you, like your background. Like, who are you? Tell me a little bit more.
Yeah,
I haven't got a funny story about you that I can share with my listeners, so I've got to ask you the question.
Well, I mean, you know, there's not loads out there, probably because I was never really one of those people who did a lot of profiling of myself. I guess I never really, I'm riddled with imposter syndrome like so many. So I just didn't necessarily see myself as someone who, I looked up to those people who did that, right? I didn't see myself necessarily as one of them. So I'm 37. I, come from quite a traditional Muslim family. My parents are amazing champions of my choices, which is also quite rare culturally. And, to be fair, it's not always been that way. I sort of went against the grain. I was always quite an outspoken child. I'm a middle child. I like to think of myself as a textbook middle child. I did a degree in pharmaceutical and cosmetic science, got an internship, went to P&G, massive company.
So your parents would have loved that. Your parents would have loved that. You would have ticked every box. Coming from an Indian culture, it's like, look, my daughter's like educated.
Did a science degree,
you made it. The next thing would be to get married. So let's talk about that.
Exactly. That's the interesting bit.
Right? This is a good conversation because it isn't just about women CEOs. It's actually like our cultural heritage, also plays a part, right? And,
massively.
I can remember like you probably being about 22 and my dad sitting there thinking like, well, she's going to get married now, isn't she? And I just looked at him like, sorry, did I just walk into some sort of like film that I am playing no part in because that's not happening right now. So
that's exactly it. I was 18 and I went to university, and I've got two sisters and a brother, and my brother's the youngest, and we all went to uni. We're all educated. My dad is a real advocate of being educated because he's worked all of his life, and he watched my grandmother get widowed quite young, and he values a woman being able to take care of herself. My mother is an incredibly spiritual woman who's incredibly fiery at the same time. She has a real sense of independence. And she's from Pakistan. She moved here when she was 22 and she had an arranged marriage to my dad, and they've been happily married for over 40 years, still very much in love. But one of the things that was really interesting was after I finished my degree, I didn't move back home. I went and got my job at P&G and I moved straight into a rented flat in Surrey, and my parents were in Hertfordshire. Yep. And I think that was, it really did go against the grain. There were a lot of people who wondered why I did that. Surely I should have moved back home. Surely I can work, but I should be considering marriage. But my parents have always been really supportive of that choice. And eventually I made the brave decision of getting a mortgage. I think at that point, quite a lot of people were wondering if I'd ever get married. My older sister got married, then my younger sister got married, and that's always quite a funny conversation. And I'd often go to weddings and people from the mosque would say, don't worry, we're praying for her.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Which is always a joy to
say
hear.
Thanks very much. But, I appreciate that. Yeah.
But I love my career. I'm really passionate and I'm a very curious person. And, I have a lot of hobbies that I enjoy. I do a lot of yoga. That's a lot to help with the endometriosis. I sort of do. I'm quite an active person. I'm currently in isolation. That's changed things a little, but, those sorts of things were really important to me. And they there were a few heated discussions around my choices, but, generally everyone's been really supportive. And then last year, when my predecessor, Heather Andrew, handed the reins over, I will never forget the day that she told me, because I stood like a rabbit in headlights. Yeah. And I knew she had said, one day this will happen. But when you just don't believe it's a thing.
What did you like, when you reflected on it, say 24 hours later, share what was going through your mind? Because there are so many people, and I think particularly women who find themselves suddenly in that position that go like, oh my God, it's here.
Yeah. The first thing I thought was, am I even capable? which is an interesting question, because I look back at it now and I know in my bones that if I hadn't have been, no one would have given it to me. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. I think the people who make those choices, they have the experience and expertise to know, and they can tell if you are. But I was like, am I even capable? And the second thing actually was to do with my health, because I was diagnosed with endometriosis about 11 or 12 years ago. I've had a couple of surgeries, and I kept thinking, what if I get sick? What if I get sick and I have to have another surgery? Now, my doctors had told me about a year and a half ago that I should have a hysterectomy, because I also have an additional condition called adenomyosis. And, all I kept thinking was, if I have to go under the knife and have to have something that, how am I going to be able to juggle this and that? It's not like someone can just come in and, take over for a few weeks while you're recovering. It's not the same as having someone in your team just taking care of projects.
Yeah.
It's really different. It feels all consuming. And the other thing I kept thinking was, how the hell am I going to have a personal life? Because, I live on my own. I kind of love my life. It's amazing. But I just thought, I'm going to have to really immerse myself in this. And I'm quite a reflective person, and I do have a lot of those sorts of conversations with myself. So I took a beat and really thought about it. But it was interesting because, for people who were looking from the outside in, so many people said, well, of course this was going to happen. Or if anyone was going to do it, it was going to be you. And I was in utter shock, because I just could not see myself the way that they saw me. And every time I've spoken to a man who's in a similar position, they're very accepting of that sort of feedback. They'll kind of go, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, that's what everyone thinks. It must be true. Whereas I think women have an inherent tendency to retreat.
So what advice would you give women? You're what now, nearly a year into being in the CEO role? It's a year on, so you reflect back. What have you learned about yourself, about what it's like to be a CEO? What advice would you give to other women?
My advice is, accept it, accept what you are, embrace it. And there is no harm in allowing yourself to celebrate that. I think women don't celebrate themselves enough. We're told not to. I mean, the idea of celebration of oneself is heavily linked to ego. And I think that women aren't necessarily, they don't feel that they have the entitlement to do that. And it's not ego.
It's not.
We have the right to celebrate because we've earned our place in the world, whether, you've given birth to a child, which is quite possibly one of the biggest things you can do. You should celebrate becoming a mother. If you are helping a friend with something, celebrate the fact that you have a right to exist in the space that you're in. I think the other thing that I learned was surround yourself with people who will champion you and tell you when you mess it up, right? I've got an amazing friend of mine who's a coach, and I used to actually be one of his coaching clients, called David McQueen, and his wife Madeline McQueen as well. They both are incredible. And, he gave me some great advice. He said, give yourself permission. It's the simplest thing anyone's ever said to me, and the most powerful. Give yourself permission and allow yourself to say, I'm great. He also said, find your advisory board. Yeah. And by that, it was anyone in your life who's worth having on it. So my two best mates, my mum, David, and another friend of mine, that's sort of my people that I go to. And I don't ever believe there's anything wrong with asking for help. I talk a lot. I'm a big Brené Brown fan. So I love all things about kind of embracing vulnerability, and it's relationship to courage, or its actual meaning being courage.
Yep.
And you don't always have to know what you're doing. Yeah. One of the interesting things for me was somebody asked me, oh, it must be great being CEO. It must be quite hard. And I said, do you know what? It's pretty tough. And I don't think people talk about that enough. But also, there is nothing that can prepare you for it necessarily, because each person does a version of it themselves.
You have to make it your own, right? It's your own. It's not. It's a role that actually, although the title has existed, the role of any CEO coming into the role is a new role, right? It's a role that hasn't been done before. I think that the
reason that these sort of perceptions exist around it is because the people who have made the noise about what it's like to be a CEO, or here's the rules of being CEO, they've kind of done all their mistake making, and they're doing it when they're quite well established. But no one talks about that first step, when you're first getting there, how, you're learning a bunch of stuff that you wouldn't necessarily have had to do before. Because even if you've managed large teams and groups, you are peerless all of a sudden, your peers exist outside of your organization, and people are looking to you to set vision. And I mean, they're the things that I enjoy the most, actually. I really like the autonomy. I also like the relationship of being able to ask people who work for me what they really want. I think that's probably one of the biggest failings, is it's not a dictatorial role. It's supposed to be about understanding the people who on the ground are making your business work. What is it that they want and need, and what is it that your clients want and need? But there's a lot of richness to it. And anybody who would ask me, could I do this? Would I be able to do it? I'd say find your people that are going to help you. Mentors are incredibly important. I feel like we should all have them from the word go. But, you can do it. Like, it's not something that's impossible. I don't feel like I went to CEO school and learned a bunch of stuff. I kind of developed some thinking, and I believe in emotional intelligence being quite key to it. But yeah, I don't feel like it's impossible for so many who would look at it and think it was.
I find it fascinating, of the guests that I've had on the podcast, and, you reflect the views of one of my other guests who is a young CEO. I call them young CEOs because you're young. I like to think of myself as young, but seasoned is the reality, right? But, of the tack that you guys are taking, which I think is heartening for businesses of the future, is to say, hey, look, this is a role that, when you get into it, it's not, you don't need to have all the answers. I think that's really refreshing to hear from CEOs. And I've heard that from a couple of CEOs on this podcast that come from this view that I think is very different to the view of CEOs in the past. So, I encourage that message to get across more. But also it's a lonely role, right? I mean, how did it feel to begin with, right? Because when you first go there, like the people that used to be your colleagues now work for you. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I did feel, I think that another thing we're told from the outside world is that you have to behave in a certain way when you get the role.
Yeah.
And that is also, partly true, but also partly crap. And the reason for that is if you're being promoted within an organization, the people around you will know you as being something else, and all of a sudden it will shift.
Yeah.
What I found was super helpful, and I talked about this on, I did a short video for the BBC they have a program called BBC CEO Secrets in the UK, where I talked about transparency about my illness with my team. And I think this is really critical to when you are making that shift, how you come across to your colleagues. You are still who you are, right? That's not changed. You will start to develop in terms of your professional persona. You will also start to develop in terms of what you learn in yourself, as we do in every stage of life. But what's really critical is to not speak to people as though they don't understand you, because we're all still people. And when I did the BBC CEO Secrets thing, what I was talking about was, because endometriosis is a chronic pain condition, and I talk about this very openly, I had to be really clear to my team, because I work all the hours God gives me, and I am
I'm sending you some tips on mental health. You need to read them. I'm very good at giving other people advice, but not necessarily following it myself. But it's important to keep that balance.
It is. It's so important. And when I first started out, I was like constantly on the go. And one of the things that became really apparent was, if I wasn't honest and open about if I wasn't managing it myself personally, then that would have an impact on my team. But in addition to that, if I wasn't open and honest, I wouldn't be able to earn their respect. in any way, because they would be able to see through it, because people are fairly good at that, you know? And so with particularly one member of my team, she's the research director, and we're friends, you know, we're good friends. And the transition, we had a really open conversation where we talked about the fact that I was from that point on going to be her boss. And we talked about how you manage those relationships. And I think P&G is a really good training ground for that, because anybody who's worked at P&G will know you work in these massive sites, and everyone's mate, everyone's other half. You know, there are lots of marriages there. There are lots of relationships, lots of best friendships, and people start from graduate level and they stay for years. So I learned very early in my career how you separate and how you manage relationships and don't take offense, basically.
Yeah.
And keep some professionalism, but also have a personal touch. And I think that's actually a really good way of just building a comfortable team dynamic. And I think that sort of shows in the happiness we have in our office, I think. I like to think so anyway.
Well, they're all listening. I hope they were going to be listening to this podcast when it, you know, and they'll be saying, yeah, we agree. We definitely agree. So tell us a bit more, like, you know, just before we kind of wrap up, because I do think like this whole, the neuro-marketing, what do you see as the future for Neuro-Insight going forward? I mean, you run the UK operation. It's an organization that has, you know, a significant role to play, I think, in neuromarketing in the future of how we look at consumerism, brands, and connecting to people, and how businesses, you know, can be sustainable in the future. What do you see as some of the future sort of outreaches for that going forward?
I mean, I definitely think that the only way is up for neuromarketing. I you know, it's starting its growth. I think it's only going to grow and get bigger. I think that currently for Neuro-Insight specifically, you know, we've been working in a certain space. So we do a lot of advertising research. Over the last few years, that's shifted into context-related work. So in the UK, we published a white paper last year, which was all about the impact of media context, because human beings are now being bombarded with information from every kind of medium that exists. You know, we've got different platforms and channels, but we've also got different devices. We're also on the go. We've got podcasts in our ears. We've got all sorts of stuff going on. So context became a big part of the conversation over the last couple of years. I now think that, you know, in terms of the technology and the way it will move, you know, we'll get to a point where we can really scale this up in a way that we've not seen. And I know as a business, that's something that we are definitely looking into. We're a really innovative kind of team of neuroscientists. They're based in Australia as part of the group business, and they're working on some really cool stuff from the tech side. I think in general for us, we're going to be moving to larger areas of insight. So we're already doing some work on understanding shopper behavior, but there'll be even more than that, because just advertising research isn't enough. I think it will be helped to do very front end design and innovation projects, you know, understanding what the needs are at a much like earlier stage. That's something that a lot of businesses do well in terms of disruptive innovation. And I was lucky to work on a couple of those projects myself in the past, client side. But that's something I think neuroscience can add so much value to.
There must be huge opportunities in the online space, I would imagine, for you guys.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
I mean,
so we do some great work looking at social media, but I think the e-commerce side is a place where we're going to develop quite heavily. I also, you know, I think that currently the COVID-19 situation has meant that people are doing everything online. I mean, they're not just shopping online. They're also working out online. They're having conversations online. They're doing classes and lessons and everything. And I do think that neuromarketing, it will just expand in terms of its reach to different areas. And that growth is going to be absolutely enormous. You know, I feel really lucky actually, because there are other businesses and other research companies that use techniques like EEG, which is, you know, a good technique. But as somebody who was client side, I mean, I was quite picky about my agencies, and I always said I'd never go agency side. The only reason I would do it is if it was someone I would have hired myself when I was a client, right, or if it was something that completely changed my life. And I feel like the SST technology does that. I mean, in a way that I can't even articulate. You'd have to read my mind to know exactly how I felt.
Well, you never know. We might have you put it on and then we'll be able to see, right? Like, I'm not sure that having my subconscious be that conscious is good for anybody, particularly when they're locked down at home right now. But that being said, I do think there are fascinating applications for it. You know, as I said, like, I had goosebumps thinking about some of the places that it could play in a much more sort of broader organizational context around culture and leadership. So that may be a conversation we have you on to talk about at another time, because it's certainly an area that I think could be highly interesting to explore. But, you know, I always ask my guests their daring to. What's their daring to? Because this is about people that dare to either be somebody, do something, think something, or just be different. What's your daring to, do you think, as you look back on your life? Whether it's work-related, personal related, what's your daring to moment?
I mean, there's been quite a few. I think one of the big moments for me was a very personal moment. And actually, it all happened at the same time. Last year in March, I got told I was becoming CEO, but at the same time, I had just publicly, after a decade, had opened up and talked about endometriosis. Rankin, the amazing photographer, I was lucky enough to have him shoot my portrait for an exhibition that was done on invisible illnesses.
It's beautiful. I've looked it up. Yeah, it's beautiful.
I found that the most difficult thing I have ever done. It was so challenging because I was putting myself in a very vulnerable and open position. I also had a headscarf, no headscarf debacle over that from a cultural point of view. You know, and I think what I really dared to do was it was a really brave moment, because I hadn't talked about endometriosis because it impacts fertility, and culturally, being known as being someone who may have fertility issues, who's unmarried and in her 30s, was not something I wanted to be associated with. And I just kept my mouth shut for a long time. And I think being brave and daring to open myself up like that and talk about it, I feel like hopefully that has paved the way for others to do the same. I will not stop talking about it. I think it's so important for us to find a cure. But I think that happening, coinciding with the moment when I got told I was going to be a CEO, they were two kind of cultural taboos that I guess I had no idea prior to that I'd be breaking during that year. So 2019 was certainly kind of epic for me.
Well, do you know what? That has to be one of the best daring to shares that we've had. And that's no disrespect to any of my other guests that have been on the show. But, you know, I think you will have opened the windows of light to many, many listeners that can relate in their own way, whether it's culturally or from just a perspective around if you think something or feel like something different, how you've opened the window of light in how you've described that. So, you know, hats off, really, I guess I would say. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think, you've like hit that emotional intensity button and my, you know, my encoded subconscious, I think there. So yeah, I really appreciate it. Now I will say, my other piece of advice is, as you said, like, you know, get out there, be visible, be who you are, be proud of it. So let's see more of you on social media and your brand. Let's get it out there. But if people do want to know more about you, get in contact with Neuro-Insight. How's the best way to reach you? Website, LinkedIn?
Yeah, our website is great. You can find me on LinkedIn. So Shazia Ginai, just look me up. But the website's great. It has all the information and a place to contact the team.
What a cool episode to a fellow woman, sister, call it what you want. Like, we band together, and men, guys, we expect you to contribute too. This is like, we're in this together, and it's not just COVID-19. We are in this together to help change the businesses of the future, to be more inclusive and to really live and show what we can bring to the world and solve some of the big problems. So thank you very much. If you want to get hold of me, you'll know where to get me, but I am on Twitter at Rita_Trahan, and you can find out more about us. Thanks for listening. Enjoyed the conversation? Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes of Daring 2. Also, check out our website, dareworldwide.com, for some great resources around business in general, leadership, and how to bring about change. See you next time.